Evelyn had collected dolls for as long as she could remember. She had always had the most spectacular collection. In her bedroom was a sea of wax faces, dotted with tiny freckles, rosy cheeks, with long eyelashes, and hair of every colour imaginable. As the daughter of a dollmaker, she was the envy of every little girl she knew. Her mother was a frail woman and required a lot of rest, and her father would spend days at a time in the workshop he kept in the basement of their house. So Evelyn's dolls kept her company, and her vibrant imagination gave them each a life all of their own. And though Evelyn was lonely sometimes, whenever her father eventually appeared at her bedroom door, he would have a new doll for her, even more beautiful than the last. At least, until she was 6. Her father had an annual tradition on the night before Evelyn's birthday. He would creep up to her room where he thought she was asleep and place a brand new doll with a bow in her hair on the end of Evelyn's bed, so it was waiting for her when she woke up on her special day. But on the evening before her 6th birthday, her father didn't come. Evelyn lay in bed, her excitement keeping her awake. After what felt like hours, she snuck out of her room and tiptoed down towards her father's workshop, hoping she may catch a glimpse of the beautiful creation he was making for her. But Evelyn found the workshop shrouded in darkness, the door locked, and her father nowhere to be found. As she climbed back up the stairs, she could hear the most dreadful moaning coming from down the hall. Terrified of the sound, she ran as fast as she could back up the stairs to her bedroom in the attic and dived under the covers, pulling them up over her head to hide from whatever monster was lurking just down the stairs. Despite her fear, she must have fallen asleep, because when she opened her eyes again, she could see the morning sunlight creeping in through the covers, which were still pulled firmly up over her head. She pushed them down and yawned as she opened her eyes properly to greet the day, and saw her father sat on the end of her bed, where her doll would usually be. He was holding something tiny, wrapped not in pretty paper, but in a woolen shawl. As soon as he realized Evelyn was awake, he beamed a smile like he never had before. "I have a surprise for you," he said. "My finest creation yet," and turned his body towards her to show off the tiny, beautiful baby in his arms. "This is your sister, Ava." The baby was the prettiest thing Evelyn had ever seen, far prettier than any doll her father had made, and her beauty only grew with her. Where Evelyn became aware that her own looks were unremarkable, with hair the colour of tarnished pennies, a freckled face, and eyes of lacklustre blue, her younger sister Ava's beauty was striking, even for such a young child. Her dark hair shone as if it were polished. Her skin was pale and cool-toned, but her round, brown eyes contained such warmth within them that they captivated anyone she looked upon. Her mother adored her. Her father drove himself to distraction, creating doll after doll in Ava's likeness, but no matter how beautiful the creation, how expensive the material, or how many hours he spent down in his workshop, none of them were ever good enough for his darling youngest daughter. Evelyn was never jealous or bitter about this, especially as she remained the recipient of her father's dolls. And though she did love her little sister, she never felt the same adoration towards her that her parents did. She was happier with the company of her sister's silent counterparts. But when Evelyn was 10 and Ava was 4, tragedy beset their family. Ava died in her sleep. That morning, Evelyn woke to an unfamiliar silence. Her sister's chattering didn't fill her room the way it usually did. Instead, everything stood still, suspended in time, as though the house and everyone in it were holding their breath. She peered out of her room to see her mother standing in the doorway of Ava's. Behind her, she could see that it was empty, the bed made and the curtains open. As her mother turned to close the door behind her, she looked up and saw Evelyn's curious face. She embraced her daughter in a way she never had before, wrapping her slender arms around her and pulling her so close that it buried her face into the soft folds of her dress. Evelyn breathed in the fresh linen smell and listened to her mother's pounding heartbeat. When she finally released her grip, she sank to her knees to put her face level with Evelyn's. A tear fell onto her cheek, so Evelyn wiped it away with the sleeve of her nightgown. Her mother didn't say what had happened, but Evelyn knew. Neither of them had the words to be able to speak it into existence, so their silent acceptance was enough. Evelyn had been staring into her mother's wide brown eyes for so long that she had not seen her father come silently up the stairs. The sight of him looming ominously over them gave Evelyn a start, and the little wax doll in her hand went crashing to the floor head first. Her father watched it drop as though it was happening in slow motion, and he wore an expression like an idea had just crystallized in his mind. He picked up the doll and inspected its delicate features, the now cracked wax on its head. Evelyn whispered she was sorry. Her mother rose back to her full height, squeezed her husband's arm gently, and said, "Be gentle with her." And with that, both of her parents were gone, leaving her alone on the landing, without even her doll for company. For a selfish moment, Evelyn had thought that with Ava gone, her mother and father would pour their adoration onto their surviving child, showering her with the affection once reserved only for her younger sister. But it was clear that Ava's passing had created an irreparable tear in the fabric of their family. Her mother withdrew, spending all of her time alone in her room. She could not tolerate to have Evelyn around. And her father holed himself up in his workshop, throwing all of his time and energy into some secret project. Whenever he did surface, he looked insane, and Evelyn felt more acutely alone than ever before. Where solitude used to bring her comfort, loneliness weighed heavy on her heart. So each night, she filled her little bed with dolls and tried her best to sleep. One morning, Evelyn awoke to see her father sat on the end of her bed. She furrowed her brow and studied his face. Surely it couldn't have been a year already. It was not her birthday, but nonetheless, he had a figure next to him, shrouded in a bedsheet. He didn't look at her when he spoke, but kept his eyes fixed on a spot on Evelyn's bedroom wall. "I've made you a gift," he said. "My finest creation." Evelyn's eyes widened. He must have been working all this time just to make something to cheer her up. She sat upright in her bed and pulled off the sheet that was covering her surprise. Underneath was a life-sized doll, identical to her sister. Every feature was exactly like Ava's. For the first time, her father had captured her likeness perfectly. The only difference was that her eyes were made from 2 marbles of gleaming glass. She sat looking at it for a long while. The doll was undeniably beautiful. It was the image of her sister after all. And she wanted to adore it, in a way that she never did adore her sister. But something about it made her feel unusual. She had been staring at it for such a long time that her father had left the room before she had even thanked him. Looking out from the crack in her curtains, she could see that dawn was only just breaking, and she was still sleepy, so she didn't have the energy to get up and play with her new toy just yet. So Evelyn placed her doll on the chair next to her nightstand, gently rubbed her puffy eyes, and crawled back into bed, slipping into a deep sleep. It was in the dead of night when Evelyn woke again with a start. The corridor outside was dark and silent, and the candle on her nightstand glowed. She sat up in her bed and looked at the doll, which stared back at her with its glass eyes. The way they reflected the candlelight frightened Evelyn, so she got out of bed to extinguish the candle. Once the room was dark, she crawled back into bed and turned her back to the doll. She tried to sleep, but she was fidgeting and could not settle. She almost jumped out of bed when she heard a loud thud. She flipped over and saw the doll face down on the floor. Evelyn screamed, and within seconds, her father shuffled into the room with a lamp. When the dim pool of light landed on the doll, he breathed a heavy sigh before picking her up and reassuring Evelyn that there was nothing to be afraid of. Her dolly had just fallen over. He relit the candle on the nightstand and told her to settle back down to sleep. She tried her hardest, but she could not shake this feeling that there was something wrong about the doll. Her sister's laughter swirled around her head, echoing in her ears as though she was right there in the room with her, taunting her. She closed her eyes tight and willed herself to sleep, but with another horrible thud, the doll fell to the floor again, face down in exactly the same spot. She heard her father's footsteps climbing the stairs, thumping and angry this time. As quickly as she could, Evelyn dived out of bed onto the floor and rolled the doll over onto its back. It was much, much heavier than she expected, and as she feared, the wax had cracked where it had hit the floor, just like her little doll. But unlike her other doll, this one's head was not solid. She picked at the flaking wax, and piece by piece, it revealed the death-grey skin underneath. Evelyn recoiled, shivering with revulsion and horror. Her father's voice rumbled from the doorway. "What's wrong, Evelyn? Don't you like your doll?"
This story was written and read by Chloe Gorman, with music by Andrew Bate. Penny Dreadfuls from the Moth Sanctuary is an audiobook series by Moth Sanctuary Productions. You can subscribe to the series on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Podbean, and YouTube. Follow Moth Sanctuary Productions on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Or for more dark delights, visit mothsanctuaryproductions.com.